few minutes. Buck?
I know we'll see you again soon, Joanne.
Show you where we're headed coming up in a few minutes. Buck and Alex, and I'll have that for you in a few minutes. Buck and Alex, we'll take a closer look at that weekend forecast coming up in a few minutes. Natalie, I'll show you that coming up in a few minutes. Natalie, I'll show you when to expect that coming up in a few minutes. Natalie, that's on the way. We'll talk more about that coming up in a few minutes. Natalie, coming up for you in just a few minutes. Natalie, coming up for you in a few minutes. Buck and Alex, I'll show you the changes for the week ahead coming up in a few minutes. Natalie, coming up in a few minutes. Natalie, take a closer look at that part of your forecast coming up in a few minutes. Natalie, outline that for you in a few minutes. Natalie.
Coming up here in a little bit, we're going to talk about 80s back in the picture, though, by the time we get to the weekend. First, let's get a check of the roads this morning with Natalie.
Hey, Alex, thank you.
We're going to take a look at the rest of the spring break week coming up in a few minutes. But first, let's get a check of the roads this morning with Natalie McCann.
Coming up in a few minutes. Buck, I'll show you those numbers coming up in a few minutes. Natalie, I'll show you which day that is most likely to happen coming up in a few minutes. Natalie.
Going to talk more details about that and when we get back into the 80s here in a few minutes. Caitlin.
And I'll show you which days are most likely to bring us some of that needed rain coming up in a few minutes. Alex and Caitlin, we'll talk more about that coming up in a few minutes. Buck and Alex, weekend forecast, we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Buck and Alex, I'll have the details on the weekend rain and how much more we can expect going into next week coming up in a few minutes. Buck and Alex, coming up in a few minutes. Natalie, I'll show you what to expect coming up in a few minutes. Natalie, what we're expecting out of that coming up in a few minutes. Natalie, with it coming up in a few minutes. Buck and Alex, we'll do all of that in your 7-day forecast in just a few minutes. Natalie.
That's coming up throughout the hour.
That's coming up for you in a few minutes. Natalie, we'll talk more about that coming up in a few minutes. Natalie, coming up in a few minutes. Natalie.